Imagine, just for a moment, that the deepest parts of yourself, your shifting moods, your sharpest memories, even the urges and desires that feel intensely personal, weren't seen as purely internal biological phenomena. Instead, they were understood as being fundamentally shaped by invisible forces, by spirits, and even by the literal journey your soul took as it descended through the starry heavens before it settled into your body.
It's a worldview that feels almost like science fiction to us today, isn't it? A reality where the psychological landscape is intricately mapped onto the cosmic one, where the boundaries between mind, spirit, and the universe itself are, well, incredibly fluid.
Absolutely. And the profound difference in how we map reality is exactly what we're diving into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're peeling back the layers of the sources you shared with us, specifically focusing on Ion Couliano's deep exploration of Renaissance Eros and Magic.
That's right.
Our mission in this deep dive is to unpack a specific and truly fascinating segment of this material, exploring what Couliano describes as the empirical psychology and, even more compellingly, the depth psychology of the Renaissance. We're going to zero in on how thinkers like Marsilio Ficino understood the inner life, desire, and the surprising connection they drew between states like melancholy and the very nature of genius.
Yes, and we'll be focusing particularly on Chapter 2 of Couliano's work, pages 28 through 52. It covers these crucial concepts of phantasms, these internal images, and the vital role of the pneuma, or spirit, as this intermediary force.
Right.
And how all these elements intertwined with ideas about the soul's cosmic origins to create a picture of the human psyche that is both incredibly complex and, frankly, utterly alien from our modern perspective.
And we're sticking strictly to the text provided, aren't we? Really trying to step into the mindset of these Renaissance figures.
Exactly. No modern interpretations layered on top unless the source itself discusses them, just the Renaissance view as presented. So, yeah, get ready for a significant perspective shift.
Okay, let's start right at the source, with the foundations.
Yep.
How did these Renaissance thinkers, particularly, following Platonic lines of thought, view desire, and the soul, the text immediately presents a view where what we might call profane love.
Which could be anything from a conscious attraction to just a kind of vague yearning.
Right. It isn't just seen as some base instinct bubbling up from the physical body.
That's the fundamental point, isn't it? From this Platonic viewpoint, desire, even in its most earthly forms, is understood as originating not from the irrational urges of the body itself, but from the deeper powers of the soul.
So the soul is the origin point.
The soul is primary. The body is involved, yes, absolutely, but it's secondary. It's the instrument.
So physical desire, the kind that has a clear bodily or sexual goal and, can be appeased physically, is actually described in the sources as an obscure secondary aspect of love.
Almost like a shadow, yeah. A shadow cast by the soul's primary engagement. The body is simply the vessel, the instrument through which this soul-born desire might manifest or seek expression.
And the text brings in Socrates here, right? His maieutic method.
Yes, his method of questioning to draw out truth. They use it to highlight this point. Socrates' approach, according to this interpretation, emphasized the convertibility of all love into intellectual contemplation.
All love, even the physical kind.
That's the claim. It suggests that even psychophysical love, the kind involving both mind and body, could, if properly directed or understood, be transformed, elevated, really, into a purely intellectual or spiritual pursuit.
So there's a potential hierarchy there, an upward path within desire itself.
Exactly. It implies that potential. It's not just about what you do, but about what desire can become.
It's a powerful idea, which brings us to, probably the single most critical concept for understanding Renaissance empirical psychology, as described in the sources, the Aristotelian theory of the phantasmic pneuma.
Yes, the pneuma. This isn't a simple idea, and the text makes it really clear it didn't just spring fully formed from Aristotle.
It wasn't his invention.
Right. The author stresses that this was not a brand new invention, but rather a sophisticated new arrangement of concepts that were already circulating in the ancient world. Aristotle might have added his idea of selective will, maybe, but the underlying substance of this pneuma, or spirit, that was much older.
Okay.
And understanding this deep history, the text argues, is absolutely vital. It says, without it, you can't truly grasp the presuppositions of Renaissance thought. Erudition alone isn't enough.
You need the context.
You need the context. And the text takes us on this fascinating journey tracing the concept back. It suggests origins potentially lie in ancient Sicilian medical doctrines, ideas connected back even to Plato himself.
Wow, okay. Sicily? Then where?
Then we move forward to figures like Diodes of Carystus. He was active around the time of Aristotle, maybe slightly before. The theory presented is that Diodes, drawing on Empedoclean medicine, another ancient source, might have actually inspired Aristotle's own pneuma theory.
Interesting connection.
And this is reinforced by comparing Aristotle's pneuma to the Stoic concept of the hegemonikon.
The hegemonikon, that sounds important. What was that?
It translates roughly as the principle or the commanding faculty of the soul in Stoic philosophy. So you have these ancient medical and philosophical ideas about a vital spirit or principle.
Like a central command.
Exactly. The Stoics developed this idea of it being in the soul's central governing part.
Okay, so we have Sicilian medicine, maybe Plato, Diodes, Aristotle, the Stoics. How does this thread continue?
Well, the text shows how this idea of pneumatic cognition, thinking and perceiving through the spirit, which had roots in ancient medicine and was refined by Stoicism, re-entered the mainstream of medical thought. This happened through the school of the physician Athenaeus in Rome back in the 1st century AD.
So it comes back via Roman medicine.
Yes, and a key figure in this Roman transmission was Archigenes of Apamea, practicing in Rome around the time of Emperor Trajan. These pneumatic physicians refined the theory. They understood that the hegemonikon didn't perceive directly, but was involved in processing the information carried by the pneuma.
Okay, so it's like the processor, not the sensor itself.
Kind of, yeah. But it's Galen, the absolute titan of 2nd century medicine, who makes a critical shift, a really crucial one for later developments.
What did Galen do?
Galen moves the location of the hegemonikon, the soul's principal faculty, from the heart, where Aristotle had placed it, squarely into the brain.
Into the brain. Okay, that feels more familiar.
Right, and he gives it a crucial function, symisthesis. The text translates this as synthesization of pneumatic information.
Synthesizing.
Oh.
Pulling together the information carried by the spirit.
Exactly. This is where the idea of the brain as the site of processing these spiritual image-bearing signals really solidifies in the medical tradition that feeds into the Renaissance.
So we have this concept of a vital spirit, the pneuma, carrying information, being synthesized in the brain by the hegemonikon. How did that specific idea survive the centuries between Galen and the Renaissance and become so central?
This is where the transmission of knowledge via the Arab world becomes absolutely crucial. Starting around the 11th and 12th centuries, you get this wave of translation of Arab medical and philosophical works into Latin.
Right. The great translation movements.
Precisely. The text highlights figures like Constantine the African, translating Arab texts in Monte Cassino, and Gerard of Cremona, translating major works by Avicenna in Toledo. These translations brought the sophisticated Arab understanding of Galenic medicine, which included this theory of phantasmic synthesis, and even the idea that specific compartments or ventricles in the brain were dedicated to different mental faculties into the Latin West.
So the Arab scholars had preserved and developed these ideas.
Yes, and their work made these concepts essentially commonplace among medieval scholars in Europe.
And the text mentions figures like Bartholomeus Anglicus.
Yes, whose encyclopedic work reflected these widely shared concepts. Concepts you also find in major thinkers like Albert the Great, Roger Bacon, and Thomas Aquinas. It shows just how integrated these ideas about the spirit and its role in cognition were into mainstream medieval thought, directly paving the way for their prominence in the Renaissance.
So the author's point here is really emphatic, isn't it, if you just read Aristotle on his own?
You miss the whole picture. Interpreters who tried to understand Renaissance spiritual processes by looking only at Aristotle in isolation completely missed the unified essence of this long evolving doctrine. They might have had vast erudition about individual figures, but they couldn't grasp the underlying cultural presupposition, the shared understanding of how the inner world actually worked.
It wasn't just some weird Renaissance quirk then.
Not at all. The text identifies this doctrine of the phantasmic pneuma as the principal theme for understanding both the mechanics and the ultimate goal of pre-modern science.
The goal? How so?
It was seen as a horizon of hope, a framework for understanding not just how the mind processed information, but how it connected to the deeper reality, the cosmos, the divine, and how that connection could potentially be perfected or manipulated. That's a fundamental difference in what science even meant back then.
Okay, that's a huge concept.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how this pneuma, this vital spirit, was actually conceived to function in the Renaissance mind. The text draws on thinkers like Synesius and Ficino.
Right, and they describe the pneumatic synthesizer, or the phantasmal spirit, metaphorically, as the soul's primary body.
Primary body, not the physical one.
No, it's not like flesh and bone. It's a body of spirit, more subtle, more rarefied. and it resides primarily in the head, described vividly in the text as the summit of a fortress.
I love that image, the summit of a fortress, and this spirit body residing there. That's where the visions and images, the phantasms, are formed.
Exactly. It's the internal stage, the canvas, the processor where the soul creates and interacts with these images, these phantasms.
But it's not just passive, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned synthesis earlier.
Far from passive. It acts as a double-faced mirror. This is a really crucial analogy used in the sources.
Double-faced. How does that work?
Okay, so on one side, facing below, it reflects the information coming in from the external world, captured by the senses. This is sensory data from the material realm.
Right, what we see, hear, touch.
Exactly. But on the other side, facing above, it reflects the eternal prototypes, the forms, the innate pre-existent information that the soul itself contains, drawing from the spiritual or intelligible realm.
Whoa, okay, so it's reflecting both outward sense data and inward soul knowledge.
Precisely. And knowledge, then, isn't just about passively receiving external sensory data and storing it, nor is it just abstract reason working alone. It's achieved through an active internal process mediated by this pneumatic mirror. It's about comparing what you perceive externally, which is reflected on one side of the mirror after being processed, synthesized by the pneuma with the pre-existent, perhaps divine or archetypal, information already contained within your soul, reflected on the other side. Knowledge is that moment of recognition, that spark of comparison between the outer image and the inner form.
So understanding happens in the pneuma through this comparison of phantasms.
That's the idea presented. It fundamentally alters their epistemology, their theory of knowledge. Understanding isn't just sense perception or abstract reasoning in isolation. It's this active, mediated comparison happening within the pneumatic spirit, using phantasms as the medium.
Okay, so we've established the soul as the origin of desire and the phantasmic pneuma as this vital spiritual body in the brain, acting as a double-faced mirror where phantasms are synthesized and knowledge happens through comparison. Now, let's look at how these phantasms weren't just theoretical concepts. They were seen as crucial to practical applications and phenomena in Renaissance life and thought.
Absolutely, from structuring memory to shaping desire and even exerting physical influence.
Let's start with the art of memory. This was a major intellectual pursuit back then, right?
Huge. And the basic premise, stemming directly from this understanding of the phantasmic pneuma, is that perceptions are intrinsically phantasmic. They are image-like in their nature, and this makes them incredibly easy, or at least naturally suited, to commit to memory. The pneuma deals in images.
So memory works best with images, with phantasms.
Exactly. The goal of these complex memory systems wasn't just rote memorization. It was to take any kind of content, a long poem, a philosophical argument, a complex classification system, whatever, and deliberately superimpose it onto a sequence of vivid images, onto phantasms.
And where did these images come from?
They could be tied to physical places, real locations you knew well, or they could be entirely generated within the imagination, within that pneumatic synthesizer itself.
The text mentions using specific kinds of places.
Yes, external places carefully chosen for their suitability for memory work. Churches, cemeteries, maybe deserted palaces, or even familiar rooms in your own home. Places with distinct features you could mentally walk through. Solitude and concentration were considered essential.
And the process.
You'd meticulously memorize the layout of the place in a strict order, say walking through a church, noting the altar, the first chapel, the stained glass window, etc. Then you would mentally place the sequence of the message, the speech, the points of your argument onto each specific part or image within that mental location.
Associating ideas with locations.
Exactly. And the belief was that this process created an indissoluble unity between the phantasmic image, the location, and the conceptual or linguistic information you wanted to remember. The vividness and structure of the phantasm engraved the information onto the memory, which itself was understood as an activity of the pneuma.
So the pneuma holds the images, and the images hold the information.
That's the core idea. And the text emphasizes there were seen to be basically no limits on the complexity of what could be memorized this way, or the creativity needed in choosing or constructing the phantasms used.
Were there different kinds of memory arts?
The sources differentiate between two main streams in the Renaissance. There was a more, let's say, utilitarian stream focused primarily on practical memorization, speeches, lists, that sort of thing. The text notes this sometimes degenerated into simpler, less profound techniques later on.
Okay, the practical stuff. What was the other stream?
The other, arguably more significant stream was seen as a continuation of medieval mnemotechnics, but deeply influenced by the universal art of Ramon Low.
Ramon Low. His goals were bigger.
Much bigger, as described here. Lull's ambition wasn't just remembering things. His aim was to construct a whole world of phantasms that could serve as a kind of make-believe language, a symbolic system capable of approximating the deep realities of the intelligible spiritual order, what they saw as the true reality, of which our physical world is merely an imperfect reflection.
A language of images to grasp higher truths.
Exactly. It connects back to that principle cited earlier. Quid recipitur ad modum recipientis recipitur. Whatever is received according to the mode of the recipient.
How things are taken in depends on the receiver.
Right. And for the human soul operating through that pneumatic mirror, the characteristic way to grasp reality clearly, powerfully, is through the phantasm, through the image.
So Lull's art, how did it work?
It involved a symmetrical movement, according to the text. First, you would translate the external world, the messy sensory input, into this make-believe language of phantasms, so the soul, via the pneuma, could process and understand it more clearly.
Okay, world to image.
And conversely, you would translate real, intelligible truth, philosophical concepts, spiritual insights into this phantasmic language, so they could be engraved into the soul's memory, into the pneuma. This gave discursive reasoning, which might be objective, but lacks inherent persuasive power on its own, the means to access and utilize these deeper truths effectively.
So it's a two-way translation between the spiritual intelligible and the phantasmic pneumatic.
That's the idea. Translating reality into the soul's language and translating the soul's truth into a form reason can work with.
This sounds connected to Ficino's interest in hieroglyphics.
Absolutely. Ficino saw hieroglyphs as powerful symbols that could directly communicate intelligential awareness, bypassing discursive reason entirely. Just pure symbolic meaning hitting the pneuma.
Powerful stuff. But some took this idea of a phantasmic symbolic language even further.
They did. Some successors of Ficino proposed that the rules of this language, the system that mediated understanding of intelligible relationships, could actually be represented physically in the form of a theater.
A physical theater, like with seats in a stage.
Not quite for plays. A physical structure, yes, but designed specifically for meditating upon and learning profound truths through the spatial arrangement and visual representation of phantasms.
Wow. Who came up with this?
The text introduces Giulio Camillo del Minio, a professor active in the early 16th century. He dedicated years and significant effort to actually building this very idea.
Was he taken seriously? Or seen as a crank?
Oh, definitely taken seriously. Camillo wasn't some fringe figure. He was respected enough to gain the interest and even financial support of King Francis I of France.
The King of France.
The text mentions contemporary accounts describing this structure, a wooden theater. We hear about it from figures like Viglius Lucamus, who wrote a somewhat mocking letter about it to Erasmus.
Oh.
But also from Gilbert Cousin, who was Erasmus's secretary, and he noted the structure was still physically present at the French court years later. So this wasn't just a drawing or a theory, it was a tangible, even monumental attempt to create a working system for interacting with knowledge and intelligible reality directly through the power of spatially organized phantasms, a kind of walk-in memory palace for understanding the cosmos.
That's extraordinary. A theater of knowledge built on phantasms. Okay, so phantasms are fundamental to memory, learning, organizing knowledge. But they were also, critically, seen as deeply involved in desire, in Eros. This brings us back to where we started.
Yes, the text emphasizes that the preliminaries of desire, the very start of it, always involve setting up a phantasm, an image in the subject's mind, in their pneuma.
The image of the desired object or person.
Exactly. And according to the sources, this phantasm, once formed, can then set the subject on one of two distinct paths.
Two paths for desire.
Yes. One path is the higher, spiritual one. The text calls it the anagogical path, leading the desire upwards towards the intelligential cosmos. This is the path of heroic passion.
Heroic passion.
It's described as leading towards an ecstatic fusion, not just between two people necessarily, but between the hunter, that's the desiring subject, and the object, which could ultimately be a divine truth or beauty represented by the beloved. Ficino and later Giordano Bruno famously used this image of the hunter pursuing the divine prey through the medium of love.
Okay, so that's the upward path. What's the other one?
The other path is where the phantasm points the desire downwards, leading only towards a need for physical release. A need that the text explicitly notes increased with postponement.
Just the physical urge getting stronger.
Right. And the example given is Polyphelus's dream from the famous Renaissance text, the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili. This is presented as a story of phantasmic desire that is both provoked and ultimately appeased entirely by the phantasm itself within the dream, after a series of complex erotico-mnemotechnic tribulations.
Erotico-mnemotechnic tribulations, so struggles involving desire and memory images.
Exactly. It illustrates how desire wasn't just seen as a simple response to external reality, but as something that could operate powerfully and even find its complete resolution entirely within the internal phantasmic world mediated by the pneuma. The image itself could satisfy the desire it created.
That's a really different way of thinking about desire and satisfaction. Now, the influence of these phantasms wasn't just contained within the mind or soul, right? The text says they believe these things could exert physical influence.
Yes, this is where the worldview gets particularly striking from our modern perspective. Concepts like love's arrows and the evil eye.
Love's arrow is just a metaphor, surely.
Not for Ficino, according to this text. He believed they were real forces, equipped, it says, with invisible pneumatic tips, capable of causing actual physical or spiritual damage when someone gazed lovingly or perhaps lustfully at another.
Pneumatic tips carried by the spirit.
Yes. The text links this idea back to Plato's description of love as a kind of ocular sickness, an ophthalmia, suggesting that the gaze itself could transmit a kind of ailment or influence.
And Plutarch, too.
Yes, Plutarch's belief in the miraculous force of sight, the inherent power in looking, is also brought in his background. This leads directly to the concept of the evil eye, or fascination, or what the Italians called jettatura.
Okay, the evil eye. How did they think that worked mechanistically?
The etiology, the cause, as described in the sources, is fascinatingly mechanical in a spiritual way. It's seen as a force, a noxious quality, emanating from the spirit, the pneuma, of the fascinator, the person giving the evil eye.
So it comes from their spirit.
Yes. This force, carried by the spirit in the form of invisible rays, enters the eyes of the fascinated person and penetrates inwards, reaching their heart, their own spirit.
So the spirit is the actual instrument of this influence, like a projector.
Exactly. The spirit emits rays that are described as resembling itself, meaning they carry the spiritual quality or disposition of the person sending them. If that spirit is malevolent, corrupted, envious, or full of some specific negative quality, those rays transmit it.
So the quality of the spirit gets transmitted.
That's the idea. The example given is someone with bloodshot eyes. This wasn't just seen as a sign of illness in them. It was believed they could spread contagion not just metaphorically, but literally transmitting a harmful vapor of their spirit and their tainted blood via these rays directly into the beholder's eyes, infecting their spirit and potentially their body.
Wow. That really drives home how integrated their system was. A negative internal state, malevolence, illness in one person's spirit could be actively transmitted as a physical or semi-physical force, mediated by phantasms and pneuma, entering another person through the eyes and causing actual harm.
Makes perfect sense within their framework, even if it sounds completely foreign to ours. It underscores how the spirit and its phantasmic contents were seen as having real, tangible effects on the world, both internal and external.
This deep engagement with the power of phantasms and spirit leads us to a famous phrase the text highlights, attributed to Ficino, quoting Xenophon's account of Socrates. Iocriis serio et studiosissime ludere.
Joking seriously and playing assiduously.
What does that mean in this context? The author says it captures the quintessence of all these phantasmic processes we've been discussing.
Right. Eros, the art of memory, magic, even alchemy, which was sometimes called ludus puerorum, a game for children.
A children's game. Alchemy.
In the sense of being a kind of serious play. What this phrase signifies, according to the text's interpretation, is that these pursuits aren't just dry academic exercises. Whether you are pursuing desire, training your memory, engaging in magical practices, or working with alchemy, you are fundamentally playing with phantasms.
Playing with images and spirit.
Yes, you are actively engaging with the internal, subtle world of images and spirit and trying to keep up with, maybe even influence, the rules and movements set by what the author evocatively calls the benevolent unconscious.
The benevolent unconscious.
Yeah.
Like a hidden intelligence guiding things.
Something like that seems implied, but the key is playing, yet seriously and assiduously. It's not idle fancy. It requires intense, dedicated application. You have to learn the intricate rules of this internal phantasmic game.
Why? What's the goal of learning the rules?
So that the disclosures, the insights, the influences, the movements mediated by the phantasms can be properly received and responded to. It's a high-stakes game, in their view, deeply engaging with the subtle forces they believed governed reality and the human soul. You have to play seriously to get results.
This paradoxical idea of playful seriousness, it seems really key to understanding their whole approach to disciplines that we might categorize very differently today: psychology, art, spirituality, even science.
Absolutely. It bridges those divides in a way that's hard for us to grasp sometimes.
Okay, so we've taken quite a journey into the foundations of the Renaissance inner life. Desire rooted in the soul, mediated by the incredibly complex historical concept of the phantasmic pneuma, acting as that double-faced mirror.
Creating the phantasms that were the building blocks for memory arts, that shaped desire's path, and were even thought to transmit physical influence like the evil eye.
And we've seen how seriously, yet playfully, they engaged with this phantasmic realm. Now, let's deepen our exploration into what the sources call Ficino's depth psychology, particularly his ideas about the soul's cosmic descent, and that hugely influential link he forged between melancholy and genius.
Right. The sources describe a specific Neoplatonic cosmology, a map of the universe, really explaining the soul's entry into the physical world. It's quite detailed. Souls are depicted as descending from the heavens, traveling through the Milky Way,
Down from the stars.
and entering terrestrial bodies specifically via the constellation Cancer. The text presents this not just as poetry, but as a kind of spiritual geography or trajectory.
Cancer, the gateway. And what happens during this descent?
As the souls descend through the celestial spheres of the different planetary realms, they are said to wrap themselves in a kind of garment, a celestial luminous veil or vehicle.
A veil made of starlight.
Something like that, yeah. A subtle body. And this veil has a precise function: to act as an intermediary. It's less pure than the incorporeal soul itself, but it's purer, more rarefied than the dense, impure terrestrial body. This intermediary spiritual body is what makes the union of the utterly pure soul and the material body possible. It's the bridge.
Okay, so it allows soul and body to connect. Does this descent do anything else?
Oh, yes. This process of descent and the wrapping in the veil was believed to do more than just facilitate entry. It was thought to actively reinforce the 7 original gifts bestowed upon the soul by God.
7 gifts? Like what?
These gifts were confirmed and kind of imprinted upon the soul and its developing celestial vehicle as it passed through the spheres ruled by the 7 planets. And crucially, this imprinting was mediated by specific categories of demons, spiritual beings associated with each planet.
Demons, like evil spirits.
Yeah. Not necessarily evil in our sense. More like intermediaries, forces associated with each planet's influence. The text gives specific examples from Ficino. The gift of contemplation, for instance, was strengthened by Saturn, mediated by Saturnian demons encountered during the descent through Saturn's sphere.
So passing Saturn boosts your contemplation ability.
That's the idea. Similarly, the power of government and empire was reinforced by Jupiter via Jovian demons. Courage was fostered by Mars via Martian spirits or demons. Each planetary sphere and its associated spiritual entities were seen as contributing specific characteristics, talents, and maybe even limitations to the soul as it took on its earthly form and nature.
So your personality and potential are literally shaped by your soul's journey through the planets.
According to this view, yes. Now, things get a bit complex here, as the text notes, because there was a blending or maybe a confusion of different ancient concepts during the Renaissance.
How so?
The Neoplatonic idea of the soul acquiring the celestial vehicle during its descent in the skies became intertwined, sometimes conflated, with Aristotle's concept of the innate pneumatic synthesizer, the spirit that's transmitted biologically via procreation and is part of the body from the start.
One is acquired from the heavens, the other is innate.
Right. They're technically different origins. Later Neoplatonists like Proclus apparently tried to resolve this contradiction by positing 2 vehicles, one celestial, one elemental, but the concepts remain closely linked and often discussed as aspects of the same subtle body in the Renaissance.
Okay, but what's the main takeaway here?
The key point, drawing on figures like Synesius, as highlighted in the text, is that these astral garments of the soul acquired during cosmic descent and the rarefied spirit generated within the human heart, the pneuma, the synthesizer, eventually became seen as essentially one integrated spiritual body, this spirit vehicle.
And this has bigger implications.
Profound cosmic implications, according to the text. The human imagination organ, operating through this integrated spirit vehicle, was seen as a system capable of recording prenatal information.
Prenatal information from before birth.
Yes. Data and influences received directly from the celestial bodies, from the cosmic gods or planetary intelligences themselves during that descent. Your imagination, your pneuma, holds the imprint of the stars you pass through.
So your inner world directly mirrors the cosmos you came from.
Exactly. This established a direct spiritual relationship, as the text calls it, with the divine or cosmic realm, mediated by the soul's descent and its resulting spiritual vehicle pneuma.
And this relationship had two sides.
Yes. The text notes a restrictive side. It shapes the soul's nature, its inclinations, its fate, influencing things like Ficino's doctrine of eroticism, how desire was inherently linked to these cosmic leanings imprinted on the soul.
Okay, so it limits or directs you. What's the other side?
The reciprocal side. This relationship also allowed for the possibility of magic, the ability to consciously interact with and draw upon these cosmic forces precisely because the human spirit vehicle was already imbued with their properties, already connected to them from that descent. You could resonate with the stars because you carried a piece of them within you.
Magic as tuning into your cosmic heritage. Fascinating. Okay, within this framework of soul descent and planetary influence, let's turn to one of the most iconic and influential aspects of Renaissance depth psychology, largely shaped by Ficino, the specific connection between melancholy and genius.
Yes, this is central to Ficino's thought as presented here. The source is firmly...
Saturn always gets a bad rap, doesn't it?
Often. Saturn is described as ruling the sign Capricorn, which is characterized astrologically as inordinately cold and dry, destructive, and crucially melancholic.
Cold, dry, destructive, melancholic. Sounds pretty negative.
It can be, but the text immediately introduces a vital distinction, one that Ficino picked up from Aristotle, who likely got it from Theophrastus. There aren't just one, but two types of melancholy.
Two melancholies. Okay.
There's the common type, the one most people probably thought of. It's produced by an excess of cold, thick black bile in the body's humoral system. This type is associated with negative traits: slowness, timidity, depression, dullness, maybe even malice, just generally sluggish and unhappy.
Right, the black bile making you miserable. What's the other type?
The other type, the far more interesting one for Ficino and for understanding genius, is caused not by cold bile, but by a predominance of the hot humor. Specifically, a kind of overheated, agitated, or fuming black bile. The text uses the term melancholia fumosa.
Hot black bile. That sounds like a contradiction.
It does, but that's the theory. And this is the type specifically linked to genius.
What does hot melancholy do?
According to Aristotle, as cited in the text, this hot melancholy confers psychic lability and instability that goes with genius. It makes the mind unstable, but in a creative way.
Instability leading to genius.
That's the idea. The symptoms Aristotle associated with it include fits of gaiety, ecstasy, lability, meaning variability, mood swings, inspiration. While the specific eccentricities might vary depending on the precise temperature or fuming quality of the bile, the extraordinary mental faculties were seen as a direct result of this specific, unusual humoral balance.
So it makes you potentially erratic, but also inspired.
Exactly. And Albert the Great, building on this Aristotelian tradition much later, further elaborated on the specific effects of this hot, fuming melancholia fumosa on that crucial phantasmic activity we discussed earlier, the activity of the pneuma.
Ah, it affects the pneuma and phantasms directly.
Yes. Albert identified two key impacts on the subtle organism of the spirit. First, it caused increased mobility of phantasms. Images and ideas could move, connect, and recombine much more rapidly and fluidly within the pneuma.
Faster thinking, more connections.
Right. And second, and perhaps even more importantly for things like deep thought and memory, it gave a great capacity for phantasms to stay impressed on the pneuma. This hot, turbulent spirit didn't just generate fleeting images. It allowed them to be retained vividly and persistently. They stuck.
So images move fast and they stick around.
Precisely. And the direct result of this heightened phantasmic activity, rapid movement plus strong retention, according to thinkers like Albert the Great and especially later Ficino, was a prodigious memory and an extraordinary capacity for analysis and insight. The rapid, vivid interplay of phantasms, combined with their lasting impression, created a mind uniquely equipped for deep contemplation and complex creative thought.
Which leads us right to Ficino's famous quote.
The incredibly famous and influential one, yes. Central to the Renaissance understanding of creativity. All the great men who have ever excelled in an art have been melancholic, either because they were born so or became so through assiduous meditation.
So he's saying melancholy, the hot kind, is almost a prerequisite.
He saw it as the condition, the temperament, the necessary internal state for achieving true greatness in intellectual and artistic pursuits. Whether you were born with that Saturnian influence or developed it through intense study and thought, which itself could heat the bile, apparently.
How did Ficino's view differ from earlier thinkers? The text mentions Henry of Ghent.
Right. The text contrasts Ficino's comprehensive view with a predecessor like Henry of Ghent. Ghent recognized the artistic aptitude in melancholics, linking it to their strong phantasmagoric faculty, their ability to form vivid images. But he denied them a capacity for higher abstract thought. He thought they were just good with images, not concepts.
So Ficino went further.
Much further. Ficino corrected this, fully integrating the melancholic type into the Saturnian archetype. He attributed to them not just artistic imagination, but the highest capacity for abstract, contemplative, philosophical thought as well. For Ficino, the melancholic wasn't just an artist, they were potentially the ultimate philosopher or sage.
Because Saturn, their ruling planet, was associated with deep contemplation.
Exactly. But the Saturnian type itself was understood to be deeply ambiguous, reflecting the dual nature attributed to the planet Saturn in astrology, both malefic, causing suffering, and also the highest, most profound planetary influence linked to intellect and eternity.
So the melancholic could go either way.
Precisely. Forced into solitude by Saturn's influence, the melancholic was characterized either by perversity, isolation, misery, deep depression, or by the highest contemplative aptitude, profound wisdom, and divine inspiration. The text quotes Ficino saying Saturn makes a man distinct from others, divine or bestial, happy or oppressed by extreme misery.
Wow. High highs and low lows.
Absolutely. It highlights the dramatic, unpredictable, intense nature associated with a melancholic genius.
And the text connects this to the modern idea of the romantic genius.
Yes, citing the interpretation of the art historian André Chastel. Chastel argued that it was Ficino's portrayal of the Saturnian melancholic that essentially revealed or prefigured the concept of the romantic genius to the modern world. That figure, characterized by variability, mood swings, sometimes appearing almost catatonic, subject to dramatic alternations between inspired furor and deep distress, embodying an intense, often tumultuous, emotional and intellectual life.
So Ficino laid the groundwork for how we often think of tortured artists or geniuses.
In many ways, yes, that archetype has roots right here in the Renaissance understanding of melancholy.
But it's important to remember, they didn't just romanticize it, did they? They knew it was also an illness.
Absolutely crucial point, and the text makes it clear. While they linked melancholy to genius, they also fully understood it as a genuine pathological syndrome, a serious illness with debilitating effects. This was recognized in the medical traditions going way back, Hippocrates, Aristotle, and connects right through to later psychological understanding, like Freud's work on depression and melancholia.
Saw both sides.
They saw both sides. The potential for extraordinary insight and creativity often linked to that hot melancholy, but also the reality of profound suffering, isolation, and despair associated with the cold type, or even the downsides of the hot type. The text gives historical or legendary examples. The heroic struggles and madness of Hercules, the philosophical intensity, but also oddities of Socrates, the passionate turmoil of Sappho, and even the spiritual or psychological dryness and despair known as acedia, often described in medieval cloisters, all seen as linked to different facets of the melancholic condition.
So for these Renaissance thinkers, melancholy wasn't just a simple mood or a disorder like we might categorize it.
No, it was far more complex. It was a fundamental temperament, cosmically influenced by Saturn, operating physically through the humors, but crucially affecting the spirit, the pneuma, and its phantasms. And this complex state was seen as the potential source of both potentially divine inspiration and profound human misery. It was intrinsically tied to their understanding of the most elevated forms of human thought and creativity, but also the deepest suffering.
It really is a far cry from our modern categorizations, isn't it?
Completely different conceptual landscape.
Okay, let's try and bring these threads together now. Really synthesize this picture of the human psyche presented in these sources. We've taken this deep dive into how Renaissance thinkers, building on centuries of incredibly varied medical and philosophical ideas, understood the inner life.
We saw how desire wasn't just bodily, but originated fundamentally in the soul.
Right, and it was mediated and expressed through that phantasmic pneuma, this crucial spiritual body, this synthesizer, whose historical understanding stretches way back through ancient medicine, Stoicism, Galen, Arab translators, medieval thought.
And this pneuma, residing in the head, acting as that double-faced mirror, was really the engine room of the psyche. It synthesized sensory input from the world below with innate spiritual forms or knowledge from above, forming the vital phantasms.
And these phantasms weren't just fleeting thoughts. They were the very medium of thought, perception, imagination. They were the building blocks for those sophisticated arts of memory, allowing complex information to be literally engraved upon the spirit.
And they shaped the nature of desire, directing it either towards that higher anagogical spiritual fusion or down towards earthly physical release. And they were even seen as powerful enough, carried by the spirit's rays, to transmit actual physical or emotional influence, explaining phenomena like love's arrows or the terrifying reality for them of the evil eye.
And then Ficino's depth psychology took this whole pneumatic and phantasmic system and integrated it with a living cosmos, describing the soul's specific descent through the celestial spheres.
Acquiring that spiritual vehicle imbued with planetary gifts mediated by demons or spirits,
which directly connected cosmic influences, like the powerful and ambiguous planet Saturn, to specific human temperaments, like melancholy.
Explaining how this particular humoral and spiritual balance, by directly affecting the activity of the phantasmic pneuma, making images move faster and stick harder, could lead to those extraordinary abilities. Prodigious memory, profound analysis, and ultimately what they recognized as genius.
What is truly striking, looking back over all this, is the integrated nature of this worldview.
Yeah.
It's all connected.
Utterly. The mind, the physical body, the eternal soul, the vast cosmos, invisible pneumatic beings or demons, they were all seen as part of a single interconnected system. Communication and influence flowed constantly between all these levels, primarily mediated by this vital spirit, the pneuma, and its phantasmic contents.
It's just fundamentally different from our modern division of labor, isn't it? Between psychology, neuroscience, physics, theology. They had it all woven together.
It's a completely different operating system, as you said earlier, a different map entirely for understanding reality and the human experience within it.
So why does taking this deep dive into a Renaissance worldview like this matter to you listening today? What does exploring this seemingly alien landscape reveal?
Well, for one thing, it shows just how profoundly diverse human understandings of the mind and its potential have been across history. Just how alien does this integrated, cosmic, spiritual, phantasmic system feel compared to our contemporary focus on brain chemistry, neural networks, or purely environmental and social factors?
Thinking about that difference, it really should spark those aha moments about the power of underlying cultural presuppositions, shouldn't it? What culture assumes to be true fundamentally shapes how it explains everything.
Absolutely. What counts as real, what counts as knowledge, what counts as a valid explanation for things like creativity, mental states, desire, even illness. It's all deeply tied to a culture's fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself.
There are assumptions about a dynamic cosmos, the descending soul carrying celestial imprints, and a powerful mediating spirit body. Those assumptions led them to a psychology that looks utterly foreign to us now, but was internally coherent for them and profoundly influential for centuries.
And it forces us, or should force us, to examine our own assumptions. We largely assume the mind is contained within the physical brain. We explain mental states chemically, creativity neurologically, or environmentally.
Which are powerful explanations in their own right, of course.
Of course. But this Renaissance view, however complex and tied to an outdated cosmology it might seem, reminds us that those are just one set of assumptions. Their system, built on spirit and phantasms and cosmic influence, led them to deep insights about memory, desire, and the nature of melancholy that were genuinely groundbreaking for their time and shaped the course of Western thought for a very long time.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it, what might be gained, or perhaps what has been lost, when our maps of the inner world become so rigidly compartmentalized, so focused on the purely material, and perhaps cut off from broader conceptions of reality or potential non-physical influences, however you might choose to understand those.
It definitely prompts reflection.
So to wrap up this deep dive, we've explored the pervasive and absolutely central role of phantasms and the pneuma in the Renaissance understanding of the mind. We've understood the soul's complex cosmic journey and how that descent was believed to shape our earthly traits and potential. And we've delved into the multifaceted, profoundly ambiguous figure of the melancholic genius, seen by thinkers like Ficino, not just as potentially ill, but as uniquely wired by Saturn and their own spirit for the highest forms of contemplation and creation.
It was a time when internal images, cosmic forces, planetary spirits, and a subtle spiritual body were all part of the same unified explanation for who we are, why we desire, how we remember, how we create, and how we suffer.
And seeing the dramatic shift from this profoundly integrated cosmos mind view to the later, more fragmented, specialized understandings of the human psyche really highlights a fundamental turning point in how humanity has attempted to map its own inner world and its place within the larger order of things.
A turn away from integration towards specialization, perhaps.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought, drawn directly from the depths of the source material we explored today. If Renaissance thinkers like Ficino saw genius, deep contemplation, and even the power of desire as products of specific cosmic influences, mediated by a powerful, subtle spirit and channeled through dynamic internal images, through phantasms of framework that remarkably accounted for both divine inspiration and profound suffering within the same condition of melancholy.
Then does our modern scientific understanding of creativity and mental states, by focusing almost exclusively on internal brain chemistry or external environmental factors, perhaps miss something important? By largely discarding any notion of complex, subtle, albeit differently conceived internal and external spirit forces being at play.
What might still lie hidden in the unfathomed deeps, as the author Couliano puts it in his notes, that these old, intricate maps of the mind, these maps of pneuma, phantasm, and cosmic descent, were attempting, in their own unique way, to chart.
That's a question that definitely lingers long after you close the book on their world.